The studio lights felt different that morning. Marilyn Monroe walked through the heavy doors of 20th Century Fox, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that usually comforted her. But today, each step felt heavier. She'd been summoned to Daryl F. Zanuck's office, and when the head of the studio called you in personally, it was never for good news. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. Everyone who passed her in the hallway smiled, waved, called out, "Good morning, Miss Monroe." They had no idea what was waiting for her behind that mahogany door. The secretary barely looked up as Marilyn approached. "He's expecting you. Go right in." The words hung in the air like a warning. Marilyn took a breath, fixed her smile, that smile the world knew so well, and pushed open the door. Zanuck sat behind his massive desk, cigar smoke curling around him like a dragon guarding treasure. He didn't stand, didn't smile, just gestured to the chair across from him with his cigar, ash falling onto the expensive carpet. "Sit down, Marilyn. We need to talk about your behavior." Her heart dropped, but she kept her composure. "My behavior, Mr. Zanuck?" She sat carefully, crossing her ankles the way she'd been taught in those early studio classes. Everything about Hollywood was performance, even the way you sat in a chair. Zanuck leaned back, studying her like she was a horse he was considering selling. "You've been late to set 17 times in the last month. You're costing us thousands of dollars every day. Directors are complaining. Your co-stars are complaining." He paused, taking a long drag from his cigar. "Frankly, I'm starting to wonder if we made a mistake making you a star." The words hit her like a physical blow. After everything she'd sacrificed, every indignity she'd swallowed, every time she'd smiled through the pain and the exploitation, this is what it came down to. She was late because the anxiety kept her frozen in her dressing room. She was late because the sleeping pills she needed to quiet her mind made mornings impossible. She was late because being Marilyn Monroe every single day was exhausting in ways no one could understand. But how could she explain that to a man who saw her as a commodity, not a human being? "Mr. Zanuck, she started, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear excuses. What I want is for you to remember something very important." He leaned forward, his eyes hard as stone. "We made you, Marilyn. You were nothing when you came to us, just another pretty girl with dreams. We gave you that name, that hair color, that image. Everything you are belongs to us." The room seemed to shrink around her. She'd heard variations of the speech before, but never so bluntly, never so cruelly. Her fingers gripped the armrest of the chair. Every instinct told her to apologize, to promise she'd do better, to be the good girl the studio wanted. That's what Norma Jean would have done, the frightened foster child who'd learned to survive by pleasing everyone. But something shifted in that moment. Something that had been building for years, through every demeaning photo shoot, every script where she played the dumb blonde, every time someone touched her without permission and called it Hollywood. "With all due respect, Mr. Zanuck," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, "I don't belong to anyone." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Zanuck's face darkened, the cigar frozen halfway to his lips. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time itself held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. No one talked back to Daryl F. Zanuck. No one, especially not an actress whose contract gave him complete control over her career. But here's what nobody in that room knew yet, not even Marilyn herself, not fully. This was the beginning of something that would shake Hollywood to its core. Because what happened in the next 5 minutes would set in motion events that the studio couldn't control, couldn't spin, couldn't bury under their usual tactics of threats and manipulation. But the most shocking part was still coming. Zanuck hadn't even delivered his real blow yet. He stood up slowly, walking around the desk with deliberate steps. Each footfall echoed in the silent office. "You don't belong to anyone?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me explain something to you, sweetheart. You signed a contract. That contract says you make the movies we choose, you appear at the events we schedule, you date who we tell you to date, and you certainly don't show up late like some kind of prima donna who thinks she's Katharine Hepburn." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to choke on. He circled behind her chair, and Marilyn felt every muscle in her body tense. This was a power play, a dominance display. Make her feel small, make her feel afraid. "You want to know what I think?" he continued, his voice dropping lower. "I think you've forgotten where you came from. I think you've started believing your own publicity. You think because men whistle when you walk by, because your face is on magazine covers, that you're special." He came around to face her again, leaning against his desk, arms crossed. "But let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Marilyn. I see a girl who got lucky. A girl who's one scandal, one bad movie, 1 pound overweight away from being forgotten. I see someone who's easily replaced." The cruelty in his eyes was unmistakable. "There are 100 girls out there who would kill for your career. Girls who would show up on time, who wouldn't cause problems, who would be grateful for the opportunity." Each word was designed to wound, to diminish, to control. This was how the system worked. Keep them afraid, keep them dependent, keep them in line. And for a moment, Marilyn felt that old fear rising up, the terror of being unwanted, unloved, discarded. It was her deepest wound, the one that had been carved into her during those foster home years, when she learned that love was conditional and safety was never guaranteed. But then something unexpected happened. In that moment of maximum pressure, when Zanuck expected her to crumble, Marilyn felt something else entirely. Anger. Pure, righteous, burning anger. Not at herself for being late, not at her anxiety or her struggles, but at this system that treated human beings like property. At an industry that built women up just to tear them down. At men like Zanuck who thought power gave them the right to crush someone's spirit. "Are you finished?" Her voice came out calm, almost eerily so. Zanuck blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Because if you are, I'd like to say something." She stood up, smoothing down her dress. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something had crystallized inside her, hard and unbreakable. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Zanuck. You did give me this name. You did change my hair color. You did create an image." She took a step toward him, and instinctively he straightened up. "But you didn't create me." "Norma Jean existed long before this studio. My talent, my work ethic, my intelligence. Those aren't yours to claim. You didn't give me those. You just figured out how to profit from them." Her voice gained strength with each word. "And yes, I've been late. Do you know why? Because I'm terrified every single day that I'm not good enough, that I'll fail, that I'll disappoint people. And instead of helping me, instead of treating me like a human being who's struggling, you threaten me, you demean me, you try to make me feel worthless." The office had become a battlefield, and for the first time in this meeting, Zanuck looked uncertain. This wasn't the Marilyn Monroe he thought he knew, the compliant girl who giggled and apologized and did what she was told. "You need to sit down and remember your place," he said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. "My place?" Marilyn's laugh was bitter. "My place is wherever I decide it is, not where you put me." She picked up her purse from the chair. "I'm done with this meeting, Mr. Zanuck. And I think we both know what happens next." She turned toward the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was it, the point of no return. Walking out of this office meant war with the studio. It meant they could suspend her, sue her, blacklist her. It could mean the end of everything she'd worked for. And this is exactly where everything changed. Because as her hand touched the doorknob, Zanuck played his final card. If you walk out that door, Marilyn, you'll never work in this town again. I'll make sure of it. You'll be box office poison. Your precious career will be over before lunch." His voice was venomous now, all pretense of civility gone. "You'll go back to being nobody. And trust me, sweetheart, nobody remembers a nobody." Her hand froze on the doorknob. This was the threat every actor feared, the ultimate weapon the studios held over them. The blacklist was real. Careers had been destroyed for less than what she was doing right now. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Turn around, apologize, submit, and keep her career, keep walking and risk losing everything. For several long seconds, she stood there, caught between two impossible choices. But then she thought about something that suddenly seemed more important than career, more important than fame, more important than anything the studio could give or take away: dignity, self-respect, the right to be treated like a human being. She thought about all the young actresses coming up behind her, girls who had faced the same system, the same exploitation, the same dehumanization. If she backed down now, she was telling them this was acceptable, that this was the price of success. She turned the doorknob. "Then I guess you'll have to find one of those 100 girls you mentioned," she said, without looking back, "because I'm done being your property." And she walked out, just like that. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire studio lot. Marilyn Monroe had just defied the most powerful man in Hollywood. The secretary looked up in shock as Marilyn emerged, her face pale but composed. Other people in the outer office had stopped what they were doing, sensing something momentous had just occurred. Marilyn walked through that office with her head high, even as her legs felt like they might give out any second. She made it to the elevator, pressed the button with a shaking hand, and waited. Those 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Any moment she expected security to come running, expected someone to stop her, to drag her back to that office. But the elevator arrived, empty. She stepped inside, and only when the doors closed and she was alone did she let herself breathe. Really breathe. Her whole body started trembling, the adrenaline finally hitting her system. What had she just done? The elevator descended, and with each floor, reality set in more firmly. She'd just walked out on her contract. Zanuck would retaliate, that was certain. The studio machine would turn against her with full force. They'd leak stories to the press, paint her as difficult, unstable, ungrateful. They'd make an example of her to keep other actors in line. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper in America would be running stories about Marilyn Monroe's breakdown or diva behavior. The car ride back to her apartment was a blur. Her driver, sensing her mood, didn't try to make conversation. She stared out the window at Los Angeles passing by, wondering if she'd just thrown away everything she'd worked for since she was 16 years old. But here's what Marilyn didn't know yet, what nobody could have predicted in that moment. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet? Because while she was driving home, convinced she'd just committed career suicide, something else was happening. One of the secretaries who'd witnessed her walking out of Zanuck's office was on the phone with her friend who worked for the Los Angeles Times. Within an hour, a reporter was making calls, trying to get the story. Within 2 hours, other actresses who'd suffered under the studio system were quietly cheering, even if they couldn't say so publicly. By the time Marilyn got home, her phone was already ringing. She stared at it, afraid to answer. It could be the studio's lawyers. It could be Zanuck making more threats. It could be her agent calling to drop her. She let it ring and ring. Finally, her housekeeper answered. "Miss Monroe, it's Mr. Milton Green. He says it's urgent." Milton Green, her photographer friend, one of the few people in Hollywood she trusted completely. She took the phone with trembling hands. "Marilyn, I just heard what happened. Are you okay?" His voice was filled with concern, not judgment. She almost broke down right there. "I don't know, Milton. I think I just destroyed my career." There was a pause, and then Milton said something that would change everything. Or maybe you just saved it. Listen to me. I've been working on something, a plan I wanted to talk to you about. What if you didn't need Fox? What if you could make your own movies, have your own production company, choose your own roles? Marilyn sank onto her couch, phone pressed to her ear. That's impossible. Actors don't do that. Some do, Milton countered. Chaplin did it. Mary Pickford did it. Why not you? I've been talking to investors, people who believe in you as an actress, not just as a sex symbol. We could form Marilyn Monroe Productions. You'd have control over your career for the first time ever. The idea was so radical, so audacious, that for a moment Marilyn couldn't even process it. An actress with her own production company, choosing her own scripts, directors, co-stars. But the contract, she started. Your contract with Fox is ironclad, for now. But contracts can be renegotiated, especially when you have leverage. And Marilyn, you have more leverage than you think. You're the biggest box office draw they have right now. The 7-year itch made them millions. They need you more than they're willing to admit. Milton's voice grew more excited. What you did today? Walking out? That was the bravest thing you could have done. It shows you won't be pushed around. That's power, Marilyn, real power. She wanted to believe him. But years of being told she was nothing without the studio had left deep scars. What if they blacklist me? What if no one will work with me? Then we'll make our own movies with people who respect artists, Milton said firmly. But I don't think it will come to that. Give it a few days. Let me work some magic. I think you're going to be very surprised by what happens. After they hung up, Marilyn sat in the silence of her apartment. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, dust particles floating in the golden light. She felt exhausted, terrified, and somehow free. For the first time in her career, she'd stood up for herself. Really stood up, with no apologies, no backing down. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Zanek's furious face, heard his threats echoing in her head. She got up, made tea, paced her apartment. Wait a minute, don't miss this detail. Because at 2 a.m., something else was happening that would prove Milton right. At the Brown Derby, a famous Hollywood restaurant, several powerful people were having a late dinner. Among them was Billy Wilder, the director who'd just worked with Marilyn on the 7-year itch. He'd heard through the grapevine what had happened at Fox that morning. She walked out on Zanuck? One of the producers at the table said, whistling low. She's got guts. I'll give her that. Billy Wilder nodded slowly, a small smile playing at his lips. You know what? Good for her. Zanuck's a bully. Someone needed to stand up to him. But she's finished now, isn't she? Another director chimed in. Fox will destroy her. I don't know, Wilder mused, swirling his drink. Maybe. Or maybe she just changed the game. You know what I realized working with her? Under all that anxiety and those delays, there's a real actress. Someone who cares deeply about the work. The studio just wants her to be a wind-up doll. Look pretty, hit your mark, don't think. But she's got a brain. She studies Stanislavski, for God's sake. The conversation continued, and it was one that was being replicated in various forms all over Hollywood that night. Some people thought Marilyn was crazy, but others, directors, fellow actors, writers, were quietly admiring what she'd done. The studio system had controlled Hollywood for decades, treating talent like property. Someone finally pushed back. By morning, the story had broken in the press, but not the way Zanuck had planned. Yes, there were stories about Marilyn being difficult, but there were also surprisingly sympathetic pieces. Hedda Hopper, the feared gossip columnist, wrote a column that shocked everyone. Perhaps, Hopper wrote, it's time we asked ourselves why Hollywood's brightest stars so often crack under pressure. Could it be that we've built a system that uses people up and spits them out? Miss Monroe has been working nonstop for years, often in roles that don't challenge her abilities. If she's demanding better treatment and better roles, maybe we should listen instead of condemn. The article landed like a bomb. Hedda Hopper defending Marilyn Monroe, criticizing the studio system. It gave other journalists permission to question the narrative that Zanuck was trying to build. 3 days after walking out of that office, Marilyn received a call from her agent. She'd been avoiding him, expecting him to drop her as a client. "Marilyn, you need to sit down for this," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Fox wants to negotiate." "What?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "They want to renegotiate your contract. They're willing to give you script approval, director approval, and a significant raise. Zanuck is furious, but he's been overruled by the board. You're too valuable to lose, and this story has gotten too big. If they blacklist you now, it makes them look like tyrants." Marilyn felt tears welling up, but this time they were tears of relief, of vindication. "I didn't think. I thought I'd lost everything." "You almost did," her agent admitted, "but you also showed them they couldn't push you around anymore. That changes everything. Other actors are going to follow your lead. You watch. You just started a revolution, whether you meant to or not." And he was right. Within months, other major stars would begin demanding better contract terms, citing the Monroe precedent. The absolute power studios had held over their talent was beginning to crack. But the most important change was in Marilyn herself. She went ahead with Milton Greene's plan, forming Marilyn Monroe Productions in 1955. She moved to New York, studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, and proved she was more than the dumb blonde the studios had tried to make her. When she did return to Fox, it was on her terms, with a contract that gave her unprecedented control. She got to make Bus Stop, a film that earned her the best reviews of her career. She got to make The Prince and The Showgirl, where she went toe-to-toe with Laurence Olivier. You won't believe this, but the story doesn't end there, because what happened in Zanuck's office that day rippled out in ways no one could have predicted. Young actresses like Jane Fonda and Shirley MacLaine later credited Marilyn's stand as inspiration for their own contract negotiations. The whole structure of how actors related to studios began to shift. By the 1960s, the old studio system would be essentially dead, replaced by a new model where talent had more power and autonomy. But for Marilyn personally, that moment represented something even more profound. For years, she'd struggled with the divide between Marilyn Monroe, the icon, and Norma Jean, the person. In that office, when she refused to back down, the two sides of herself finally merged. She was no longer just playing a role the studio had written for her. She was authoring her own story. And that's what made this moment truly revolutionary. Not just for Hollywood, but for Marilyn Monroe as a human being trying to find her own voice in an industry designed to silence it. Years later, when reporters would ask her about that day, Marilyn would say, "I finally understood that I had to fight for myself because no one else was going to do it. The studio wanted to own me, but I wasn't for sale anymore." She'd pause, that famous smile flickering across her face, but with something harder behind it now, something earned through struggle. Walking out of that office was the scariest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the moment I started actually living instead of just surviving. The truth is, what happened between Marilyn Monroe and Darryl Zanuck in 1956 was more than just a conflict between an actress and a studio executive. It was a battle for human dignity in a system built on exploitation. It was about a woman deciding that self-respect mattered more than safety. And in the end, it was proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply say no to people who think they own you. Hollywood would never be quite the same after Marilyn walked out that door. But more importantly, neither would she. The industry tried to break her that day. Instead, She broke their system. Not completely, not permanently. Hollywood has always been good at protecting its power structures. But she cracked it enough to let light in, to show other people trapped in the same system that resistance was possible. That dignity was worth fighting for, that they weren't property, no matter what the contracts said, and that, more than any movie she made, might be Marilyn Monroe's greatest legacy, the woman who was told she was nothing without the studio, who proved she was everything precisely because she refused to accept that lie. What you've seen is nothing compared to the courage it takes to walk away from everything you've built when your dignity demands it. Marilyn Monroe did that, and Hollywood, despite all its power, despite all its threats, had to bend. Because at the end of the day, they needed her more than she needed them. She just had to be brave enough to realize it. That's the real story of what happened when Marilyn Monroe walked into that office and everything changed. Not because of what she said, but because of what she refused to accept. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. One person in one moment deciding they deserve better. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against someone in power? What would you have done in Marilyn's position? Would you have walked out or stayed? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more incredible stories about Hollywood legends, courage, and the price of dignity. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.